Hi, everybody. I am so happy to be with you again. You should have just finished reading chapters 4 and 7, or the essential passages thereof, talking about the metacognitive and cognitive dimensions of reading apprenticeship. I'm so pleased to be back with you to give a quick synopsis of some of the essential concepts of these chapters. Is it possible to capture these chapters in a 5 to 10 minute video? Probably not, but I also did want to take the opportunity to lift up some of the harmonies that come throughout these chapters that are certainly essential to understand and to kind of reinforce here. And so I actually wanted to start off today's 5 to 10 minute lecture with a quote. And that quote is from Unknown Origin, Folk Wisdom. Some of you may have heard this. The expression goes, prepare the child for the road, not the road for the child. As you were reading through these chapters, you inevitably came across passages that emphasize the importance of building efficacy within our students to tackle any problem that comes their way. Kind of like the old expression about teaching a person to fish rather than buying them a fish. This is kind of a core belief of this module and of these chapters, which is that our students have an immense aptitude and capacity for problem solving. And what many of them need is just the facilitation to learn how to unlock their own problem solving potentials as readers, but realistically, generally as thinkers. Reading is just one form of thinking after all. And so the idea that we want to prepare our children for anything that comes down the road, not running ahead and essentially fixing all of our content in a way that addresses where our students are at that moment, kind of building that forward momentum to empower our students in the face of adversity or roadblocks, is going to be a very large resonating theme throughout these chapters, as many of you have just discovered. So today I want to just go over three core concepts from these chapters that you may have already engaged with. I want to lift up a couple of my own golden lines from these chapters. And so let's go ahead and get started. The first major concept that you, of course, ran across in these chapters was the incredibly important dimension of making thinking visible within your classroom, whatever that means for your room. Thought is naturally invisible, and to bring it into students' literal visible eyes, to draw it out, to write it out, or to just have those conversations is going to be a core concept of these chapters. The second is establishing an inquiry culture, and the third is making problem solving explicit. Now, I'm going to go into each of these three very briefly with a quote. So let's go ahead. Let's look at concept number one. So, making thinking visible. I want to read this quote from chapter 4. Metacognitive conversation is a revelation for these students, an introduction to their own and others' thought thinking processes. It makes it possible to take control when reading, to approach increasingly complex texts in a growing range of specialized genres with a sense of efficacy. Now, what does this actually look like in a classroom? It can look like a number of things. It can look like modeling annotation and active thinking while reading. This can be on a document camera, or it can be through another means. It could also mean doing think alouds as a quote unquote expert reader. When you do a multiple choice problem on your exam, or when you confront a very complex problem in your field, what do you, the instructor, do in your head? Putting that thought process out into your classroom and even mapping it in whatever way is most comfortable is incredibly important. The third way it might show up is through explicitly listing reading strategies. This is a big concept that came up in chapters 4 and 7. The idea that your classroom should have a dedicated space that grows throughout the year, kind of like a living wall that is collecting some of the best practices of your discipline. The example here is from a science classroom where the teacher has collected strategies that the students have generated throughout the year. These are organic strategies on this list pictured here. They were not given by the teacher. They were generated one by one over the course of the year by students who lifted up that these strategies had helped them personally, and the teacher honored that and wanted to capture it visually on the wall. It could also live in daily routines, such as metacognitive journaling. The one pictured here is a two-way conversation between student and teacher, in which the student did a complex task, such as a rigorous reading, and then they reflected on their thinking process. And the teacher responded with some notes or feedback on that reflection. So whether it's a 5-minute question or a whole class activity, making thinking visible has a very large return on investment. And that's one of the reasons why it's concept number 1. The second concept that I want to bring up from chapters 4 and 7 is establishing an inquiry culture. So the quote is, "Students who find academic reading difficult often do not recognize that they are confused, or if they do, may not feel that they can do anything about it. Bringing confusion out into the open and establishing an inquiry culture in class can help." This is an immensely important concept from these chapters because it really captures what a classroom should look and feel like. That was a topic covered in depth by Module 2, about the social and personal dimensions of reading apprenticeship. But the idea that it also connects with a metacognitive conversation is something that needs to be lifted up here. Because when students walk into a room, they should be first and foremost posing questions. They should first and foremost be raising confusions and seeking understanding, not necessarily just absorbing information passively. And so the way that a reading apprenticeship classroom looks and feels and sounds is it's one that's driven by questions, by peer-to-peer connections and conversations. So establishing an inquiry culture could look like daily conversations between students, not on what answer they got on a practice problem, but how did they get there? What was their unique process from point A to point B, and how was their process unique or different from their partners? It could also look like partners being thrown into rigorous thinking challenges together and being challenged to communicate with their partner about their rationale or justification or thought process, which will not only force them to verbalize their own thought, but it'll also expose them to a different way of thinking from their partners. And a third way that it would look to establish an inquiry culture, again, would be to actually chart or track that inquiry culture explicitly. So a giant anchor chart, as the one pictured here from a science classroom, that collects questions that students pose in class. The first one there says, why can reading science feel harder than reading novels? Or why are food proportions getting larger? Which was a topic lifted up in an informational text. These are questions that students can come back to later on in the unit, but the point of this is not to necessarily answer the questions, but to honor the question asking process within the classroom. Students who feel confident to take risks and to pose questions are more likely to generate new questions on a daily basis and to pursue the answers to those questions, which again is almost the definition of an inquiry culture, and it's one that will drive the metacognitive and cognitive development of your students. The third and final concept is making problem solving explicit, which is again built off of concepts 1 and 2. The quote I chose from the chapters was, "Helping students assemble a toolbox of cognitive reading strategies often means starting from students' sense of themselves as problem solvers in areas other than academics. So students' sense of themselves as competent problem solvers will have already been surfaced and validated." So again, think of reading apprenticeship as a construction of thinking practices, not necessarily of reading. A reading apprenticeship classroom, one that's driven by unearthing strategies, one that's rooted in unearthing self-awareness of our own process. This can be applied to mathematical thinking, it can be applied to writing, it can be applied to changing a performance, thinking through the process. The broader topic of just thought and thought processes is one that can be universally applied across different topics, and the toolbox will almost always come in handy as a reader specifically. So what does this look like? This could look like, again, daily work with problem solving in very small proportions. It only takes one math problem or one paragraph of really rigorous text to completely capture a classroom for 20, 30 minutes. If the question is meaty enough, if the problem solvers in the room are motivated enough to crack it. And so making problem solving explicit, taking it one chunk at a time, is one way it could show up. It could also look like lifting up students' voices as experts, putting them in the front of the room or a digital room, whatever it may be, to hear from their perspectives first. In this photograph, this instructor is actually taking the seat of her student, kind of done a reversal of roles, and is allowing the student to facilitate the problem-solving process. And last but not least, doing small little activities where students have to pull out and label the explicit reading strategies that they themselves or their partners or their teachers use on a particular task. So this is a double entry journal from a reading apprenticeship classroom in which they were scripting on the left about what they heard their partner do or say. And on the right-hand side, they had to identify, using the class's organically built strategies list, to identify what were the brain strategies being used. The example here, the student identified their partner using background knowledge, noticing a fact that they didn't know, and so on and so forth. Again, the goal of making problem solving explicit. And so as we close out this module and as we move towards our Flipgrid final project on this module, I just want to lift up these three concepts as really the backbone of these chapters. I'm eager to check out the other gold mines that we lifted up. There are certainly dozens and dozens of other very explicit strategies and other ways that this lives in the playbook as well as in the chapters. But I hope that this video gave a quick overview of some of the core concepts of this module, and I will see you all soon in Module 4. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.